Hello, good morning, and welcome. It's another beautiful day here in Edinburgh. I hope it's as nice where you are. I'm Mark Stephen. I'm going to be chairing today's event. Welcome to Scot-Secure 2021. This is day 2, and it's the biggest event of its kind here in Scotland. If you're going to be going on to social media about this on Twitter, use the hashtag #Scot-Secure if you wouldn't mind. It just allows us to follow any traffic there is. We've transferred as much of the value as we can from the physical events into this virtual environment. We've got everything here: presentations, discussion, networking via live chat facilities. We have a range of solution providers from across the supply chain in the virtual exhibition area. It goes without saying, these events can only happen because of the support of these exhibitors and sponsors. So if you can, please take the time to visit the stands and engage with them. There are a number of competitions and prizes on offer in the exhibition hall with a leaderboard to reward interaction and participation. Just click on the leaderboard icon at the top of the page to find out more. Some exhibitors, cunning devils that they are giving away prizes at the booths. It includes a Nintendo Switch, an Apple Watch, a £50 whiskey voucher, a £300 John Lewis voucher, over £300 of Amazon vouchers, a Fitbit, and an experience day. Apparently that's supercar driving, spa, afternoon tea for 2, but I don't think all at the same time. Could be, don't know. Please do explore the platform, engage with the sponsors, and make the time to chat with your peers throughout the day. We've introduced a new live video chat function to this event too, allowing you to have real-time face-to-face conversations. Just click on the chat icon to begin. There are also 2 themed group chats in the networking lounge you can join, as well as general networking chat room. The conference sessions will be run through a series of webinars. To access the sessions, just navigate to the auditorium page and click the session you wish to attend, or select the hyperlink in the pop-up boxes which appear immediately before the main sessions. Now, this first session will be considering practical steps to build and improve organisational security. Our first speaker is Jordan Schroeder, managing CISO. Sorry, I knew I was going to get that wrong. Jordan Schroeder, managing CISO. And the theme of his talk is security never just happens. So, Jordan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mark. I'm really excited to be able to speak to you today. People lean into their strengths. When a information security professional starts to rise in their career, one of the things that they get really good at is solving and mastering technical problems and linear problems. And linear problems are those things for which there is a one-to-one relationship between the problem and a scenario and the solution. And as someone gets better in their career at being able to do this, they start to be given more and more challenges, more and more problems, and then they start being given people to manage, and they were managing people, managing technical problems and linear problems, and then they rise to the point where they are a chief information security officer, a senior security manager, and then they're tasked with building a program that's going to be resilient, secure, and to figure out a way on how to scale that. But the more that you need to scale up your security program, the more things become less linear, and you end up with a problem that is far more unlinear than anything else. And you need to have a different mindset, and you need to have a different approach and different tools in order to be able to tackle these nonlinear, unexpected, uncertain problems. I like to use an example of driving in extreme weather conditions. So if you can imagine that it is minus 40 degrees, Fahrenheit or Celsius, it doesn't matter because it's the same number, it's the same temperature. It's minus 40 degrees, it's at night, it's starting to snow, and you need to drive for 2 hours in mostly uninhabited land to reach the next town. How do you think about resilience in this scenario? When looking at something this extreme, now I like extreme driving scenarios because that's where I learned to drive. I learned to drive in exactly that kind of scenario in the middle of nowhere in the middle of Canada. And there are 2 types of resiliencies and 2 types of resilient approaches that you can start looking at. And there's what I call a small R resilience and a big R resilience. Now, the small R resilience is mostly a linear problem. And if you're driving extreme weather conditions, it's really quite easy. The mnemonic that I was taught was the 4 Fs, which was, fire, fleece, flood, and food and flares. So you need some way of keeping yourself warm until you're going to get rescued. So you need some kind of you need candles, matches, lighters, something in order to provide warmth inside the cabin of the vehicle, because the engine's probably going to die at some point. You need a blanket, a fleece. You need some kind of a blanket to keep yourself warm. You need food so that you are going to be comfortable, maybe for a day or two in this type of situation, and potentially flares. You don't put them in, light them inside the vehicle, of course. You want to be able to somehow draw attention yourself so that rescuers can come and maybe passersby can notice that you need help. And this is a type of small R resilience. This is a linear problem. If you have one person or if you have 10 people, you just simply multiply the number of things that you need in order to keep all those people warm. And this is really, really simple. This is really straightforward. When it comes to cybersecurity and when it comes to information technology, your small R resilience is more about a resilience of these operations. It's the equivalent of keeping the servers warm. It's about keeping everything alive and operating at the expected levels. So you want to restore operations to their functional state, and you want to return the system to a secure state, right? If things broke, if things had a vulnerability, if exploits were used, you want to remove them so you don't have that problem happening again right away. Now, if you're looking for a practical path for how to do scalable resilience in IT, in a large organization, small organization, if you want to scale it from a team to a department to a global organization without looking at any specific threat or any specific problem, it's really quite simple and really quite straightforward. You do threat intelligence gathering or threat modeling to get some ideas to what could happen. You run risk management processes to figure out what's your priorities and how you want to invest your resources to mitigate those problems. You run exercises to test those ideas. You look at your incident response lessons learned, and you distribute that down through the organization to as many different pockets as you can to make sure that they're resilient, they can keep the servers up and warm and functioning, and they know what their threats are and they can handle this. If you try to manage this at a central point, you end up with a bottleneck and this becomes a problem. So you want to distribute it as far as you can. In a small R resilience situation, your strategy here is you want to reduce your single points of failure. You want to have plans for the widest range of possible threats. You want to have awareness of the possible threats so you can run your risk management program. And you use technology as a force multiplier so that you can, again, copy, paste, rinse, repeat, just add more of those processes that which you've identified, which are going to tackle your resilience issues. So if you were looking for a simple, scalable, linear resilience program methodology, there it is, right? It's really, really simple. So then why aren't more organizations resilient and secure? It's because there's another type of resilience here. In order to survive an extreme winter driving event, in order to survive any type of extreme event where things can happen where you cannot predict, you need to have a very, very different approach, a different mindset, and a completely different set of tools, because uncertainty can sneak up on you. Uncertainty, by definition, is a situation, is a threat or a risk or something that you cannot predict. You don't know when it's going to happen, how it's going to happen, if it's going to happen, in what way it's going to happen, and you have no idea how your responses to that are going to affect that threat, those risks, those issues. You simply don't know. It gets to be perfect uncertainty when your responses trigger a response from that threat. And so you don't know what to do in any situation, any linear approach. And if you stick to a linear approach or think that a linear approach is what's going to get you through, you just need to do more of it, you just create a bit of a tangled mess. And we've done this with our information technology that we use for our businesses, our enterprises, for everything we do. We have web servers, which are a absolute tangled mess of various frameworks, technologies, layers. We have all of these things all smushed together in order to get them to do what we want them to do and have them work operationally resiliently. But it is a massive knot that becomes almost impossible to untie. And at this point, we can't untie it. We're left with this tangled mess, and we're adding to it, not simplifying it for the most part. And the threats themselves are getting extremely complex, and they're evolving really, really fast. For instance, ransomware. I took a look. I wanted to do some research in preparation for this speak, and I wanted to. Ransomware is something that we're dealing with quite extensively. The public sector is dealing with it. Higher and further education is dealing with it quite strongly right now. There have been some recent articles about this. So I wanted to create a timeline to get a sense of just how quickly things have evolved. And in 2013, you have the first crypto locker. That was 7 years ago. Now, as of last year, we are now looking at multi-stage hybrid infections and ransom. That is a hybrid of human and automated processes all happening together. Ransomware is merely one factor of a much larger type of a situation and a much larger threat. And you have ransomware, which has totally changed its approach, where instead of encrypting the data and then ransoming you for access to the data, they exfiltrate the data. They steal the data, they post it or store it publicly, encrypt that, and then extort you for money to prevent them from releasing it. So this is a completely different approach. Uncertainty is nonlinear. You can't predict what's going to happen. We can take a look at these ransomware threats and this timeline and see the connections, but we can do it in retrospect. We can see the connections and patterns in retrospect, but we run into a problem if we then assume that our solutions are also linear. Because in 2013, we could not have predicted what we're dealing with now in 2021. We couldn't have predicted this. It would have been one of the many possibilities, but we'd have no idea how to prepare for that. So one of the important things that we need to do as people leading resilience at scale in our organizations is that we need to become comfortable with perfect uncertainty. We need to accept the fact that we are not in control. We don't have perfect knowledge, and the solutions that we have, our linear solutions that we have, only work for linear problems. So what we need to do is we need to build a way and processes and a culture and our expectations and how we speak with management and how we speak with users and how we speak with investors and stakeholders. We need to have an approach where we can build resilience in perfect uncertainty. Luckily, there are some models that we can borrow and we can use to do exactly this. What I have on the screen now is what's known as the OODA loop. OODA stands for Observe, Orient, Decide, and Act. This was born from the U.S. military. Corporal Boyd was the person who famously did this. This is a very famous model in military circles. Boyd came up with this model because he was getting frustrated with battlefield decisions being made by management, by commanders, in that they were trying to gather more and more and more data. They were trying to build dashboards. They were trying to build metrics and KPIs, and they were trying to reduce the battlefield situation into a linear problem for which they could apply linear solutions. And Boyd, who was a fighter pilot, said, you can't do this. This is not going to be successful. And so he developed this model as a way of thinking and a way of looking at things. Now, you may have seen this OODA loop as a perfect circle. This is very funny for a lot of OODA specialists because making this loop a perfect circle turns OODA into a linear solution, and this is supposed to be a non-linear solution to non-linear problems. So always be careful about OODA loops being described as a perfect circle because there are a lot of concentric circles in here. There's a lot of feedback loops. The idea is you want to get your information, and you get your information from a variety of different ways. The next step is the most important. The next step is to orient. Boyd was very, very clear that everything else all stems from and feeds the orient process. You need to understand what is happening. You need to get to truth. And I realize it's a big term and I don't want to get into great philosophy debates here, but his terminology, his focus is to get to truth, understand the truth, and then you can manage and make decisions based on a truth and not what you think needs to happen in a linear way. Then you make a decision. Now, since this originally came out, people have now modified this to just put in a description for what people actually mean, and that's you make a hypothesis, and then you act. But this act is not a final act. You're not done. This is a test. You orient yourself to the information, you figure out what's truth, you try to get out of your biases, you try to get out of your inertias, your internal culture, you try to get to the truth, you make a hypothesis, and then you test. You act on it and you do something to see what happens. Then you feed that back into the orient to figure out what's happened, how do we do this, and we move forward. Now, this might seem like a complication of a very simple thing that everybody does all day long, but it is an important mental model to keep in mind so that you can build processes to do this. The important thing is that you need control over the OODA loop. Control can mean the speed at which you get information, you orient yourself, you decide and you act. Speed can be really, really important, but it's not the key thing. It's not the most important thing. What you need is control. You need control over that speed. Is it too fast? Is it too slow? Are you acting fast enough? Can you decide fast enough? Are you able to pivot? Are you able to be agile enough to make decisions, figure out what you need to do, and do what needs to happen next, and then evaluate that and then quickly pivot in case things didn't work out the way you wanted? So control over that OODA loop is really, really, really important. So how do we do this practically? This is all conceptual. How do we do this practically? At a really high level for cybersecurity resilience at scale, my recommendations are this. You need to increase your situational awareness. This is different from dashboards, metrics, and KPIs. Dashboards, metrics, and KPIs are a form of and a expression of some types of situational awareness, but you need something more than that. You need information from the people, you need information from the outside, and you might need to know small things, little things that might indicate the truth that you need to respond to, even if the big things are telling you something differently. You need to understand the truth. You then need to run experiments, right? The language of hypothesis and test, you in your leadership role need to run experiments. Will this work? Does that work? How does the threat respond? How do our users respond? How do our customers respond to this? You need to run experiments, and you can't have the mindset of we're going to do this and the effect is going to do that. We don't know yet. All we're doing is running experiments. And yeah, we might have high confidence that the experiment's going to work, but ultimately we might not know. And you need to have a perspective. You need to have an outside perspective to get the head above the water, get above the operational things, and take a different view of the problems, the solutions, and what's going on. To do this in a very practical way, to put this down into really practical terms, again, we're back to threat intelligence, threat modeling, to understand what could be happening. Staff risk reports. Get your staff to tell you what they think that is wrong or is a potential problem. And you need to try different solutions. This is a difficult thing because budgets are already tight, and it's difficult to get approval for any budgets because the decision makers and boards and investors want, certainty. But you need to be able to express things in terms of an experiment. And you, instead of trying an experiment across the entire organization, to consider smaller experiments that are safe to fail. That if they fail, everything's okay. You haven't invested too much money, haven't wasted too much time. It's not that big of a problem. So try different things, experiment, put them in, see what the effect is. And get a CISO or security manager, senior security manager, someone who has a strategic perspective to look above the problems, to look above what's happening operationally with their hands in the guts. Or if nothing else, take the CISO that you've got or the senior security manager that you've got and give them time and permission to be thinking more freely, to get their perspective above what's in front of them, above the fires that they're fighting, and allow them to be thinking and looking for different solutions and different problems. The other model, which will be very, very useful, is direct from complexity management, and one which is growing in popularity and is gaining a lot of ground right now is something called Kinevin. And this is a very dense and complex diagram from the Kinevin framework. And it breaks things down into 4 different domains. On the right-hand side, you have linear issues and solutions. On the left-hand side, you've got the non-linear. And the big thing in Kinevin is that center part. That center part where it's labeled as AC in the diagram is where you don't know. You don't know what it is yet. And you need to figure that out. You need to sit down, figure that out. What are we dealing with? Are we dealing with a clear problem or a complicated problem or a complex problem or a chaotic problem? What are we dealing with? Because depending upon the nature of what it is you're dealing with, that'll depend on the solutions that you put in place in order to tackle them. And if you put the wrong solutions, the wrong types of solutions in place, you end up forcing a problem into the chaotic domain and things get worse, not better. So one of the things I like to pull out when talking about Kinevin is what's known as the Alcoholics Anonymous prayer. Not bringing in any personal comments or any comments anywhere else. It's just a famous prayer that I think is applicable here. And it's grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. This is an interesting way of expressing the Kinevin approach, which is we don't necessarily know at the offset what it is we need to change, what we can change, but we need to be able to accept the things we can't change, deal with them in a different way, and have the courage to be able to put all of our resources and all of our thinking to solve those linear problems, those simple problems in the ways that we can. So how can we use Kinevin in a practical way to handle cyber resilience at scale? And I propose these 3 things. Automate what you should. Don't automate what you can, because there's lots of things you can automate that you shouldn't. Figure out what should be automated. Figure out those things that are linear, those problems that are linear, that have a linear solution. And because linear solutions scale automatically, you should be putting investment in to solve those problems in that way. You should be buying the technology, advancing the technology, adding more of that technology, whatever's working, do more of that when it makes sense. For those nonlinear problems, you need to collaborate. You need people's ideas. You need people's thoughts. You need diverse perspectives, different ideas, and you need to bring them into a melting pot to figure out what needs to happen next. And you need to find these non-linear solutions, these non-linear perspectives to the problems that you face and your organization faces, your department faces, your team faces, your service faces. And you need to be able to sort that out and learn to tell the difference between a linear problem and a non-linear problem and what solutions work when and where. Patching is one of those things which likes to straddle the line between being a linear problem and a non-linear problem. 90% of the patches that are out there are a linear problem and a linear solution. They should be automated. They absolutely should be automated. And then you end up with Exchange. Right now, we're experiencing a global problem and a global crisis because Exchange isn't getting patched. Why isn't it getting patched? It's because an email server is not a linear thing anymore. It used to be. Email servers used to be really simple, but it's not. I used to work for an organization where the policy was that we patch all the rest of the servers as soon as a patch came out, but the Exchange server needed to wait 2 months before patching was going to be approved. Because if the email server went down, and when the email service goes down, it goes down hard, and it's very difficult to bring back up, that we needed that time, and we needed that assurance that whatever changes we make, we're going to be successful. And so we're seeing these problems right now in the world today, this week, because people are concerned that the email servers are going to come down. And we need to think outside of patching as a linear problem in these cases. And we need to come up with different approaches. We need more situational awareness. We need different perspectives. And we need to have different types of solutions, parallel solutions, including being okay with the email server going down and having alternate means of communicating and different ways of handling this. The other thing that I highly encourage, and this week I just released the Stoic TTX tabletop exercise framework and 3.5 hours of facilitator training on the framework. And I have a huge huge respect for the output of tabletop exercises, and that organizations should be running tabletop exercises not once a year, not twice a year, but really, really frequently, once a month, once a week, in terms of smaller teams, because things change so fast. People's experience change so fast. How people use and change the technology happens so fast that you need to keep abreast of these things. And you need to have a structured conversation to allow some of these thoughts to come forward and these diverse opinions and perspectives. And a tabletop exercise is the perfect way to do this. So in terms of that situational awareness and gaining that information and figuring out a way how to orient the team, the organization to that information, a tabletop exercise fits the OODA loop really, really, really well. So to scale big R resilience in an organization, we need to be comfortable with perfect uncertainty and to be able to design our processes, change our thinking, use different mental models, use different tools so that we can build, strengthen in a way that reflects reality and not just what we expect the problems and the solutions to be and what we expect of our users, organization, and the world. The world is complex. The world is uncertain. Let's accept that, let's make that core, and let's build resilience around that idea. Thanks very much.
Jordan, thank you very much for that. That was absolutely fascinating. If you'd like to ask any questions of Jordan, after our first three speakers, we will actually be doing a question and answer session. So just go to the bottom section there and you can type in your question there, and I'll try and process as many as I can get through in the limited time we have. While Jordan was talking about the OODA concept, the OODA principle, it put me in mind of another soldier, the Duke of Wellington. He had no patience at all with people who tried to write a history of the Battle of Waterloo, which was probably his most famous victory. He said, you'd be as well trying to write the history of a society ball or dance or something. He says, it doesn't work that way. And the fact is that, life is not linear. People do not behave 9 times out of 10 in a linear way. So it's something I want to come back to with Jordan. Our next speaker is Sonia Mwazey, lead security engineer for Photobox, and the title of her talk is Keep Calm and Secure Your CI/CD Pipeline.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Keep Calm and Secure Your CI/CD Pipeline. So I'm Sonia, I work dark hoodies, and I listen to too much synthwave music, so I am a legit security engineer. So I wanted to start to give you a little bit of context. This talk is focused around open source projects and what can go wrong in those. So basic example would be having credentials, tokens, environment variables on GitHub. We know that GitHub is housing thousands of publicly accessible keys, tokens, password, or search in the search results. So just to give you an example, with a simple search, I typed API keys, and here I'm having thousands of results. You can do the same with credentials, with passwords, or any of these keywords. So you would find keys for services, including Google, Twitter, Facebook, Stripe, Twilio, and all of those services. So how it looks like, so basically the developer would push the keys on GitHub, and if they realize that they've pushed production keys, they'll try to actually delete that key, but that's a little bit too late because GitHub is based on version control, so it's kept in the history. Another consideration for open source is what is a secure SDLC in that environment. So basically for companies, the security software development lifecycle process will ensure that at every stage, security is an integral part of the development efforts. So such as penetration testing, code review, threat modeling sessions, or architecture analysis. At that stage, the security will be a continuous concern. We'll have awareness of security consideration by stakeholders, and we'll have early detection of flows and cost reduction. So this is for within a company or organization. But what about open source project? How can I protect my open source project in that case? First of all, disclaimer, the perfect CI/CD pipeline doesn't exist. I'm sorry. But I'm taking a case study here with Prime London. So Prime London is an open source project with a lot of maintainers. We're in charge of the website and the application on that side. And we're using quite a few open source tools as well. So I'm going to go through all these tools and give you a little bit of overview of each and how it works within our CI/CD pipeline. First of all, where we're finding those tools. So we're using the tools on GitHub, the GitHub Marketplace, which is great because they do have applications in GitHub Actions already coded, and you could find those around code quality, code review, continuous integration, or continuous deployment, monitoring. So I really would strongly invite you to have a look at the GitHub Marketplace if you weren't aware that this exists, because it's a good starting point, actually, if you want to protect your open source projects. And how it looks like, so usually when you click on one of these tools or application, it's usually free for open source and public repository. So you just have to click and install it on the accounts or the organization that you have on GitHub. And on the organization, you can click on the third-party access, the tab, or the install GitHub apps. You have all the lists of tools that you've already installed. What I would recommend is to cherry pick the repository that you would like to have these tools installed in. So just to give you a context of what we're using the Jamstack Trinity, so Contentful, Gatsby, and Netlify. So Gatsby is a React.js framework where we're using GraphQL queries to create our CMS, which is Contentful. So Contentful is our content management system. This is where we're developing all the models. So it's quite basic. So for example, if we have an event, we'll define our models on that one. This is where we will have all of the all the models. We're also building the website using Gatsby Cloud. So this is where we'll have all our preview branches, all our deployment builds, and also this is where we could test if the website is built correctly. This is also where we'll host all the environment variables, because obviously we don't want to have the issue that I mentioned earlier. And we'll also have all the steps. This is more for a DevOps curiosity if you want to see all the steps when your website is building. And finally, we're hosting on Netlify. So this is usually mirroring the logs that you have on Gatsby. But if there is an issue on one or the other, we can bypass one and just host it on Netlify. So as I said, the logs are quite mirroring or quite the same. So now let's move on to the tools. We're using quite a few tools. That's because we have the luxury of being an open source project, so we're not constrained by any budget limitations. So the first one that we're using is Circle CI. This is for our continuous integration. So basically, all of these tools works on the same. So they will check every time that you push a pull request or a branch, and they will trigger all the features that are based on. So for Circle CI, we're using this to run all our unit tests and to see if everything is working fine. So to configure Circle CI, we're using a config YAML. So this is just to simplify. So Circle CI is spinning up a Docker image just to fetch the repository, spin up the environment, fetch all the variables. We also have a step with yarn lints, and then we're running all the unit tests. And then in our case, I will talk about CodeCov. We have a coverage report on that. We're also using GitHub Actions. So we've been trying using both for different tools. So if you don't know where to start with GitHub Actions, they actually have some starter templates, which is good. So they do have one for CodeQL, which is their static analysis tool. And it's quite easy to set up because you already have the template. You just need to add the programming language that you're using. The examples that we have here, this is for Sonya Clouds. So basically, also when you go on the documentation, and if there's a GitHub action, usually you can just copy paste the template that they already have, so you don't need to create from scratch the YAML file. And on the platform, on Sonya Cloud, once, as I said, the developer raises a PR, it will trigger the scan for that specific branch, and you'll have all the metrics on the dashboard. Also, a good thing for the environment variables, what you can do, and this is quite cool, you can actually set up this at the organization level. So if you go on your organization settings and then secrets, you can define and add all the secrets that you have. And also the good thing is you can select a specific repo and it will cascade to that specific repo, but you have everything located on your GitHub organization. For unit tests, we're using CodeCov. So this is basically to cover and make sure that our code base is fully covered by tests. So as I said, all these tools are working the same way. So when you have a pull request or a branch, it will trigger the feature of the platform, and it will give you usually a lot of metrics and nice heat map and delta. So in that case, for code curve, you could see on the right-hand side all the branches, and in pink you have the total of coverage, percentage coverage for the code base, and it will give you a delta if that score is going up or down, and where there's some areas that actually you could improve on. Also, when you raise a pull request, there's a nice widget that will be implemented within your pull request to give you that report, so you don't have to go on the platform. For those of you who are familiar with the command line, you can also have that report directly on the command line. If you're not familiar with the command line, you also have an alternative with the HTML version where you can browse it on your browser. So now we're moving to the code reviews codes. Obviously, this is also part of security because we want to have like a clean code, but we also want to catch any duplicates, any code smell, and also just to assist and support on code review. So we're using Code Factor. And the same, it's going through all the branches. And when there's, let's say, code smell, duplicates, or something that we should have a look at, they will flag it and give you some recommendation and snippet of codes for the developer to just try to fix that. We're also using Deep Scan. That one is specific for the JavaScript ecosystem. It's covering TypeScript, React, Vue. So that one is really specific to JavaScript, a really good one as well. It's giving the dashboards and all the metrics that you need to see if you're improving or not. So just so that example, it will flag in yellow the area of improvement. And if you don't understand that error, you can click on that one, and it will give you more information and a snippet code. Another one that we're using, so basically we're using a couple of tools for code reviewing because we know that they're tapping in different kind of database. So it's always good to have different sources to have that visibility and full coverage. So we're using also LGTM. LGTM is a product that GitHub has acquired. So this is natively integrated. And the same, it's going through all the branches and giving you more metrics. Here you have metrics around the line of codes that you're having in your code base. So if it is kind of information that you also want to have for your application. And as well, it will flag if there's any duplicates, code smell, and all of those. The good thing here is for that piece of education for the developer, there's a reference link, and usually it links to the official documentation, which is good because that's a point of support for the developers. And also the cool thing with LGTM, you can compare your open source projects against the other open source and how well or bad you're doing in that ecosystem. A quick one is pull request size. This is more because we're based on the agile workflow. So we want our pull requests to be small so we can iterate quickly. So this one will add a tag just to specify the size of your pull request. Back to security and compliance, we're using the tree. So the tree is a Git-based policy engine, and this is helping us to maintain a healthy open source project because it will flag any issues or things that you should have a look at, like best practices. So we could mention, for example, ensure that you have code owners defined in the project, that you should archive your dev repository. If you have any inactive members, if you have a lot of maintainers, that's a good way to flag all of those. So that is a good tool to support that healthy open source best practices. Another security tool that we're using is guardrails. So this also is static scan tool that will flag if there's any hard-coded credentials or any of those. And the same, it will go through each and every pull request and branches that you raise, and just let you know if there's any vulnerability. Now that we've seen the security and static code analysis, let's move on to the third party. And we're using quite a few because we think that open source also can be impacted by vulnerable third-party packages. So we're using quite a few tools around that area. The first one is Sonatype Dev Shield. So with this tool, we need to keep in mind that it's raising issues. So it's not really acting on, it will just give you visibility that there's a vulnerable package. So this is good if you want to have that visibility, if you want to understand what is the CVSS code for score for that vulnerability. But if you want to act on the vulnerability, I would recommend to add complement tools on that. So I would mention dependency graph and dependabot from GitHub. Those are native tools from GitHub. So the dependency graph is by default installed on every public repositories. It will go through your code, and if you have your own log for JavaScript ecosystem or gem file log for Ruby or requirements.txt for Python, they will go through that file and flag if there's any vulnerabilities within your third-party packages. The good thing is that you can set this organization-wide. Sorry. So you don't need to do this manually one by one if you have a lot of repos in your open source projects. You can just go to settings, security and analysis, and you can just tick the boxes, enable all, and also for all the future repos that you will create in your ecosystem. And this will turn on dependency graph and the dependabot alerts. So dependency graph will give you visibility, but as I said, the most important thing to fix your third-party vulnerabilities is to actually act on it. And the good thing is with dependabot will raise an automated pull request. So how it works, so usually in your pull request tab, you will have a PR raised by dependabot that will give you the version that you have to move to. And usually, you don't have that confidence to actually merge. So they have what they call Compatibility Score. So what it is, so usually they will compare with other open source projects, and if it doesn't break their CI pipeline, they will actually increase that score. And there's also good integration with Slack. Also, the good thing is that you can configure dependabot. So just letting know the tool on which directory you want to scan, the schedule. Also, if you want to do this daily or weekly or monthly, I would recommend that. Yeah, and also this was for version 1. I know GitHub recently released a version 2, which make it more granular. So if you want to have more options, I would recommend to go on and have a look at their documentation for the version 2. We're using another well-known tool, which is Snyk. So Snyk basically is doing the same thing. It's going through your in our case, our package.json, and will let us know if there's any vulnerability within our third-party packages. There's also really neat integration for Slack. And finally, on the live monitoring, we're using Rollbar. So once the website is live, if there's any errors when the user is navigating on our website, we'll know what kind of errors are those behaviors, just to better understand and fix those issues that we couldn't catch during the testing phase. So how does it work on GitHub? Because you might say, okay, that's great, Sonia, you've showed us a lot of tools. How it actually work on GitHub? And that's a great question. So the developers, when they raise pull requests, so this will actually trigger all the tools. So you'll have the usual pull request, and when you scroll down, you'll start seeing if it's available, all those widgets integrated within your pull request. So you don't have to go on the dashboard. You have all the information here on your GitHub pull requests. And also at the bottom of the page, you will have the list of tools that you have. And this is just a happy scenario when you have all the checks that are passing. But usually this is what you would have where you, when you're doing code review, you'll have probably change requested. You'll have probably 1 or 2 tools failing along the way. Or I have your branches out of date with the base branch. So you'll have all that visibility within the PR at the bottom of that PR. Also, this was on the conversation tab. If you go on the checks tab, and this will depend on how natively it's integrated with GitHub, you'll also have all of those information. The same that you're finding on the dashboard from these different platforms, you will have all this information within your pull requests. So another question is how to get value from chat ops, because you can have chat ops when you're working in a company, but can you actually apply those within open source projects? So chat ops basically is to link all the tools and use a platform like Slack or Chime from AWS or any others as your single source of truth when you have all the notification following and coming up to one endpoint. So we're using Slack at Pride, and this is where we have specific channel for specific tools, which allow us to have that visibility. So you could see here for Circle CI, for Netlify, for guardrails. So if there's anything breaking during the pipeline, we can have that visibility and act on it because we have all the developers on the channels. So this is where we can act on them. Also, we have the GitHub integration, and you could see that in live, when the developer will raise the PR, you'll see the code color, it will change. So usually it start with this amber orange-ish, and if there's any issue, it would be flanked in red. So you see that from Slack and from this integration, if there's any issues, you can actually fix them from there. Any documentation on GitHub? Yes, because we're talking about open source, and also because we want to have more maintainers, and it's really important to have documentation. So we've been using the GitHub boards for that. So basically, with using all the labels and the epic, this is quite the same. And we have all those, the same as you could find on Jira. And we're using also the GitHub automated tab. So basically, you don't need to touch anything. It will move from the card when you merge, or when it's approved and when it's merged. A good thing is all these tools have tags. So I would really strongly recommend to have all these tags that show the health of your open source projects on those. One last thing, what about access control on GitHub? And yes, that is a really important question. So I would recommend 2FA by default required for all your maintainers. I will also recommend to have base permissions as none, and you would create groups, teams, and you would allocate these users to these groups and have access to specific repos and have access to specific rights on those. So on GitHub, you have read or write access, just to have this division. And also, I would also recommend you have several reviewers. This is more the GitLab workflow. Don't forget to protect your master branch as well. And also you have all the, as you can see, this is required. This will be all the tools that you find that I've mentioned during the CI/CD pipeline on that. So this will be on the master branch. Finally, some key takeaways. So we know that open source can be a vector for large-scale cyber attacks. I will mention the British Airways case. We know that it has been compromised by a third-party organizer. I would recommend to leverage the applications available on the GitHub Marketplace. As I said, there's a lot of tools and GitHub Actions that you could use. Create a small pipeline and harden your GitHub security for your collaborators. There's quick wins that are like with the 2FA, with protecting your master branch. Experiment, and please don't push your keys on GitHub. I'll just finish with my motto: get secure, be secure, and stay secure. Thank you.
Sonia, thank you very much for that. Obviously, I am not a cybersecurity expert. Communication is my line of work. So the next speaker is of particular interest to me because Ceri Jones, Technology Security Manager for the NatWest Group, wants to talk about the importance of language, because obviously you're not always talking from one expert to another expert. The importance of language in effective security engagement. So Ceri, over to you.
Hi, and thank you very much. So I'm here to talk about the importance of language in security and how we engage with people differently in that security conversation. And part of that comes from having a background in researching people-centered security for about 10 years now, and recognizing that actually there's a lot of just repeated language that we use over and over again in the thought that it motivates people, but actually it isn't always as straightforward as that. And so what we see often in security is that we see that logical space with technology. We talk about technology all the time in very particular ways. But security is a very broad brush approach, and there's a lot of creativity and a lot of logic and creativity that blends together, that builds a particular way of viewing things. And so a lot of people, though, don't see that when they see security. They see this really gated, really kind of negative view on the world, because when we look at security messaging, when we look at how we communicate, the belief that talking about threat and talking about telling people that because they're at threat, that then they're going to do something, leaves them feeling often adrift. And it often makes them feel stuck between a rock and a hard place of knowing what is the right behavior as well, because a lot of the behaviors, or expected behaviors, I should say, aren't particularly consistent, because dependent on whether you're in work or outside of work, the messaging can be different, and it means that people often don't know where to go. So honestly, I have told people what I do as a job, and I say to them about the word security, and the instant reaction, I have physically seen people recoil away from me because they really just don't want to have any sort of conversation. While I believe that it is I'm deeply passionate about this, and I believe there's a lot of creativity in this space. Unfortunately, that isn't the lived experience of a lot of others. So what can we really do about that? So in security, we, as professionals, we speak in a particular way. We call people wetware, we call them weak. We say that things are simple and things are easy to do and they can just be secure. So why aren't people doing it? Why don't people just do the things that we want them to do? But realistically, the world is not that straightforward, and it's not that easy for people in any shape or form to do the things that we ask them to do. And it's not because they can't, and it's not because they're unintelligent. It's actually because when you break it down, security doesn't happen in just one instance. When you say, for example, setting up a telephone, you're doing it on multiple different occasions at multiple different times. And if you look at the example of, say, two-factor authentication, it's not always called two-factor authentication. Sometimes it's called multi-factor authentication. Then what you do is you try and set it up, and each time it has a slightly different way of doing it. You can use an authenticator, you can use SMS and what have you, which means each time you have to try and describe it differently to different people. But what we try to do in that description is try and use words that people genuinely do believe that is easy for them to do, because it should be just one task at hand in that moment. But it's not actually that easy, because a person is a person doing multiple different things at multiple different times. They're not just an individual concentrating on one individual task most of the time. So we have to try and break that problem down for people and be more realistic. Because if we don't, what we end up doing is basically people think, this isn't for me, this isn't related to me, and it's got nothing to do with me. Why are you expecting me to add this layer of security? And often what we find is that people just stop engaging because they've had that negative reinforcement of the language that we use around this space to then make them feel bad, make them feel guilty, and then often used as the people to blame in this scenario, when, as we know, in actual fact, security is very complex and there are lots of reasons why things happen. When you see on a system in an organization, in your SOC, something pinging is going wrong, and you can see somebody doing something that they shouldn't be doing, it's not as straightforward as to just believe that it's that person's fault. Because as the first speaker spoke about, security is very complex. So to determine things to be good and bad is actually really hard because there's lots of other explanations. And so when we look at security, what we find, though, is that we want to tell people there is good behavior, bad behavior. There's good things to do and there's bad things to do. But again, it kind of gives the wrong impression because it's, again, not that straightforward. And that complexity means that as we speak about it ourselves and as security professionals, when we speak amongst ourselves, we also build up this belief system and mental model that this is the way it should be. And there's no other way of doing it. So there is just one way and there is just another, the other way, all the other ways are just bad. But in reality, like I said, that isn't true. And I have had many presentations from different companies. And an example of this is they were chalking up different sorts of behaviors, prioritizing what they considered important or not. And those that they didn't consider good behaviors were actually then determined to be behaviors on a naughty list. But you think to yourself, if you're classing people and you're classing behavior as naughty and you're writing that down on systems, and that's the way you then describe it to people who haven't had that time to think about this topic, it predetermines then how you deal with it, what you see in that person, and then how you go forward and help solve people. Because at the end of the day, security is here to support and guide people to be more secure. It's not to determine right and wrong for them. It's not to just determine those things. It's to actually help them. And are we really helping them by doing this? So one of the things that led me to doing this talk is that I wrote a blog a couple of months ago after many, it was actually after the Black Friday. And when Black Friday comes out, all you see is be secure online, but it's easy to do. And what they do is then give you a list of 10 steps. They then give you 10 behaviors or 6 behaviors to help you be secure online. But actually those 6 things and those 10 things is quite a lot for most people when they're just trying to buy something online in a quick deal during a one-day event. Putting it across in that way isn't getting people to pay attention in the way that we expect. And so we build up like I said, this apprehension of actually how to be secure. And what we do see and what we are starting to see in our society is that people have started to mock security messaging. There's loads of jokes about it online. There's TikTok videos that really pull apart the confusion that we see in this space. So why do we use this sort of language when we know, and realistically, that cybersecurity isn't easy, and we're not being realistic, and we're not really telling the truth about actually how to be secure? And what we need to do is move to a position of being able to build knowledge, capability, and confidence in people. Because at the end of the day, security or cybersecurity isn't actually that simple, and we need to question ourselves of why we use particular language. It doesn't bode well for us as security experts because we come across as really bad salespeople. We come across as people who tell people, well, you can just do this and then everything is secure. And then what people hear on the news is that things are always being breached, their data is getting lost. And so it's not a good conversation because it isn't quite as, again, straightforward as we believe it to be. And what we do by coming across in this way is also when we tell our seniors in organizations certain things in particular ways or build up security to be in a particular way, it leaves us feeling really quite just like we're struggling, because that honesty is something that's lacking, not because we want to not tell the truth. It's because there's a certain way that we want things to happen and it's difficult to get our point across. So, and that comes down to that complexity that exists in that space and that transparency that we actually really need to have as a community about why these things are difficult and what we can do to build into a better place than where we are currently. And like I said, part of that is down to the language that we use. And we see this in most of the things that you will read. So most of the things that we read is that there's always us and them, no matter if that is a internal conflict between an organization and the staff, or security and the business goals. But it's also an external threat, because security is about firefighting a lot of the time. There is a lot going on. There are a lot of moving pieces. So keeping abreast of all of those changes takes a lot of effort, and it takes a lot of time for us to be able to even try to comprehend. So what we do is we end up using this language of threat, of othering people, making them seem like other to us. But in actual fact, that's not true. We are people like everybody else. And we need to be able to think of people in a way that is more approachable and more realistic. Because if we don't, what we end up doing is we might feel happy that we've told you what to do and we've stepped away. And if you're not doing it, then that really hasn't got much to do with us, because we've siloed ourselves away in our happy bubble. But the other people around us might feel confused, might feel unsure, and they really don't know what to do. So how do we bring ourselves to people in a way that allows them to take part, in that security conversation and recognizes the value that those individuals bring? Because each person has a different lived experience when it comes to security. And there is great strength in being able to listen and being able to understand what they're really saying. It's not to determine, like I said earlier, that things are good and bad. It's just to recognize that in some cases, you might actually have in your management chain some senior that has determined that person to do a particular behavior. They've carried it out, and then they get blamed for doing something, when in actual fact, because of the culture that exists around them, they had no other option. And doing this sort of thing is not to think of being nice. It's not to just be nice to people. It's actually about thinking of people as real people. So, for example, I don't use the word user because that predetermines how you view people in one way. You do have user research and what have you, which is fine because you're using a system in a particular way at a particular time, and that's what you're testing for. But in general life, when we're talking about people within an organization or people outside of an organization, they have many other things going on. And without looking at them as a whole person, we miss what positives that they bring realistically and what we can learn from each other and how to move forward together. And often, like I said, what we do is we put people off, and we don't really want to be doing that as a profession. It is not the goal of most people I have ever met in this arena at all. Most people are extremely creative and positive about it, but that then oddly isn't what we see translated. And we have to think why. But realistically, a lot of it is down to the words that we use, and because our words have power. And when you don't have that knowledge and you don't have the background, it can seem very off-putting. And one of the other things that we also see as well is that when we look at security, we believe that often we speak about it in a way that people don't know what they're talking about. They still aren't secure, so we just need to tell them more and give them more information. But in actual fact, this was a survey done by the NCSC a couple of years ago. And when asked about how they feel about protecting themselves online, most people came back to say, in actual fact, they either know a great deal or a fair amount, which shows that when we give out messaging to tell people things are easy and simple, that isn't what they need to hear either, because they already feel they know enough, or they feel they know they have an amount of knowledge. So how do we fit into that instead of just trying to give them the same information over the same period of time? So we need to re-angle and reframe the way that we view security and the way that then we communicate the security messaging to people. And this can be done in multiple different ways. We have security awareness training, we have security messaging, and there's a lot, like I said, a lot of people in this space doing really good things, but that is often not seen. It's often, you have to be in the know to know the people who are doing the great work, and there are many of them. But across the board, unfortunately, a lot of that goes under the bridge, and we just don't see it. But what we really want to do is, in that wider community, is be more positive, reframe security in a way that makes sense for people, to take out the very large descriptions at the beginning of most things you read about cybersecurity that give you a full description of, for example, what a social engineering attack is. People actually don't need to know that information. What they need to know is maybe something short as an introduction. They need to know what they can do about it, a very action-based, concise actions of how to do that thing. And then you can follow up perhaps with a why that's important for them. Because at the end of the day, we're not trying to change people, we're trying to influence them, and really quite subtly influence them over time as well. We often hear the words behavior change in this space, but to get behavior change takes real effort, real resource, and probably will take over 10 years to actually have effective, ongoing, habit-forming behavior change. It is not as straightforward as just saying the words out loud. So what we need to do is dedicate some more time, be more realistic. Because what I see out there is, in actual fact, a lot of it is this unwillingness to believe there's a different approach, that security has to be said in particular ways, which becomes then very fixed ideas in people themselves. And so when you are creative and you're trying to do something different, it can make it very difficult as a job to go against that, to say things in a different way, to want to come across in a different way, because there is a belief to be secure, you have to terrify people to death, and then you have to give them long explanations of what they're doing. But that is not true. There is no fixed way of doing things in this space. So what I would say is challenge assumption and push those norms. And it takes effort, don't get me wrong, but to think to yourself, does this make sense? Because at the end of the day, what good means for me does not mean good for another person. And we need to reflect every now and again on, is this appropriate? Does this make sense? And have a more conscious and considerate approach to the way that we do our security messaging, the way we communicate, and the way in our own communities that we speak about people as well. Because like I said, it builds bias and it builds in these stereotypes that are really quite hard to break down when you're making decisions about risk, when you're making decisions about what is the best thing to do. But of course, this is not straightforward. This is a stepping stone approach, and it does take time. It can be quite challenging for people, and it is not the most straightforward way of thinking. But realistically, what we're trying to avoid is making people feel bad. We're not setting people up to fail. We want people to understand, like I said, build capability, build knowledge, build skill. And to do that over time, it's not to make them sudden security experts. I'm not saying that is not what I want to do at all. It's just to realize where people are at and to speak to them at their level. Because at the end of the day, security frees us to do the things that we need to do. It is not there to get in the way. It's not there to make people feel a threat. It is there to allow them to live their life every day and to be online. Because if we don't, what happens is that we turn people off. And if they're turned off, re-engaging people is actually a much more difficult conversation to be had. And the language that we need to use is completely different, because people are turning off to security. They feel fatigued to the messaging. So we have to be very conscious of what we are doing. So if you want to read about the blog that I wrote, this is the link to it. Thank you for your time, and thank you for listening.
Ceri, thank you very much for that. So 3 very different presentations there, and there's a chance to actually run through some questions and answers. Still time if you want to stick a question in at the bottom of your screen there, and we'll try and get through as many as we possibly can. I'm going to start off by asking my own question, and I'd like the views of the 3 of you on this. I mean, Jordan, you were talking about some solutions are linear, some solutions are non-linear, etc. I said life is non-linear, people are non-linear and things. If the line as a concept doesn't work, what does? I mean, I've been listening to the 3 of you, and I've been trying to think, what is this? Is it a bit like a cooking recipe? Is it ingredients? Is it melding stuff together? What Sonia was talking about seemed to be chucking a whole heap of stuff at a problem. So again, it's getting an analogy that makes sense to me as a non-security expert.
I think the model that you've presented, Mark, is very apt. It's life. I mean, security isn't a technological problem until it becomes a technological problem. Then you've got technological solutions for that. And Sonia has provided an expert overview on how to secure that line when it's linear. And it's really awesome tools, and a lot of work have been done in that way. But as Ceri was talking about, when we're dealing with people, security isn't a push button thing. It's not something you can buy. It's not something that you plan for and design and put in place and then it happens, right? Security is what happens. Security happens when you work securely. And it is, as a security manager, you can't dictate, you can't push down from the top and say, thou must do this and thou must do that. It's about encouraging people to do things in a more secure way, providing support for them to doing that, and hearing from them. Ceri said, talk about that conversation. Get that information back from them to figure out how you can support them better to move forward. Cybersecurity is far more of a people problem at an organizational level, at a build line and a continuous development and continuous integration level, things are different. Things can be more linear at that level. But at the whole organizational level, you're trying to get everybody to act and behave and talk and consider things as a conversation, and how we can support actions as a result of that conversation. There is no simple solution to a complex problem. You have to approach it in a complex way, but there's ways to do that. It's called listening. It's listening and providing responses that make sense for everybody. And yeah, there's compromises that need to happen, and there's give and take that needs to happen, and things evolve and mature and change over time, and that's okay. It's about that conversation. It's about listening. It's about providing solutions to them, not providing policies to them to follow. And that's how you get that engagement. And that's how you change behaviors in less than 10 years, because you are helping them do what they want to do. Right? And if you can tap into what they want to do, you can change their behavior in a day. If you support them well, if they feel heard, and if you can get them to do what they want to do in the first place.
You're nodding, Ceri.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree with all of that. I think one of the things that's really underestimated, as I was just saying, is that ability to listen and actually then do something different because of what you've heard. So a lot of people will have these feedback groups, will have a lot of workshops, but it goes back into the minds of people who sometimes can't think in a way that will then push that space forward. And this is why security needs that diversity. It needs different sorts of people to be able to bring out these elements, because there are different ways of approaching. And as I said just now, part of that is about reframing that conversation, because there is an expectation that security should be a particular way, because that's what we've built it to sound like. That's the language that we've used for so long to make it become. But again, there is no fixed way in that at all. There is no real hanging on the fact that it needs to happen in this way. It can be quite a fluid thing, and we need to be adaptable to that. And true, as Jordan was saying, true resilience is the ability to adapt, is not to stand still and just think, well, if I stand on this really high hill away from people because I know I'm secure and I'm happy being secure in this way, then everybody's going to come to me. No, we need to bring ourselves to people in the way that we need to help them and support them. And that's what's really important. And that's what really creates engagement. And a very quick example of that, I spend a lot of my time reviewing a lot of work and a lot of comms, for example. And by reframing, just like a password email, I had feedback that told me that it was the best email they'd ever received in all of their years working, just by slightly reframing, not changing the content, not taking out the technicality of why it's important, but by literally just being more positive, framing it from a slightly different direction, and people really engage, because it's not about putting them off. It's about trying to make sure that they can actually see why they're important and how they can take part.
Sonia, I listened to your entire presentation. I'll be absolutely honest, I understood very little of it, because I'm not an industry insider. You know, it was a bit like a dog watching a fireworks display. I could tell something wonderful was happening, but I'm not sure what it was. How do you communicate with people like me? I mean, do you have to, in your day-to-day work, communicate with people like? Do you feel you should have to?
I guess for the maintainers of open source projects, having those processes and best practices is a good way for also them to have healthy projects. We were trying to have really high standards at Pride, like using all those tools within the CI/CD pipeline. Obviously, not all open source projects have that level of complexity, but usually what we would do is going to that kind of events just to be more vocal of those best practices and how we can have quick wins on those, and just to explain that this is also possible to have that. I shouldn't say complexity. I should say like to have easy CI/CD pipeline that you could apply for the open source ecosystem as well. It's not something only for companies, because as I mentioned, all those tools are free for open source and public repositories. So why not experimenting and implementing within your pipeline?
Okay, supplementary question. If these tools are free and if they can do the job, why are so many companies spending a small fortune in cybersecurity? Why does that happen?
So the model on the GitHub Marketplace, they make it free only for open source and public repository. They have other plans for private repositories and for companies, unfortunately. But yeah, I guess it's more in the open source mentality that those tools should be free, just to improve the quality, the overall quality of those projects.
Okay. A question here from Max Ing from Lloyd's Banking Group. And it's a question for the whole panel. I'll start off with you, Ceri. How can you make threat modeling or similar design risk assessment more consistent, as automated as possible, and tracked through the change pipeline?
That's quite a long question. So I think
just use the big like.
So I think one of the things in a lot of the risk assessment and threat work is that it is only from a technology point of view. So you will see things like the MITRE ATT&CK framework and what have you. And when it references a person, it will say just train them. And the one thing I will just say is that when you're looking at these, the idea of training will not solve the problem. Training is not a silver bullet approach. Just because it's written down in some threat model that you can train staff does not mean it's just that straightforward. It takes a very dedicated amount of effort to have the consistency of an approach, to build, like I said, that capability and knowledge over time, and then to be quite honest with people that security messaging and security in the background does change and that threat landscape moves. So you also have to be quite adaptable as a person to the security itself. So when you see things across that threat modeling and doing risk, just saying, just train staff, make them aware, it really does underestimate the volume of effort. And because if you're not doing those things well, what happens is that it allows you to push the risk back onto people as if there's some determining factor in your security, as if that one person really is the failing for your entire company. And if that one person is the failing for your entire company, then your security model is all wrong, because they shouldn't be allowed to be the last hurrah, basically, of chance, because things like phishing and what have you are literally just chance opportunities that may affect you in particular ways or may not. No matter how much training you do, that is still really quite unpredictable, because you might have all the technology in that it will do everything that you hope, but there is still the chance that it'll still get through and it will still hit all of your technology. So what you do is you have to build confidence in people that they can tell you about it, and then you can learn about it and move forward and adapt and do things in more consistent ways so people know that, so they don't feel, like I said, stuck, which is what training can often do, because it just tells them one aspect of one thing in one way.
You've just given me a new lifetime ambition. I now want to be the last hurrah of chance. I don't know what it means, but it sounds fabulous. John, same thought, any questions on exactly the same question? How do you make threat modeling or similar design risk assessment more consistent?
By doing it more often and figuring out how that works for the different contexts in which you're doing it. I mean, in terms of CI/CD, that threat modeling process is really unique to that context and those people and there's a different threat. It's in terms of people processes and people handling training. Ceri, I'll toss this your way. Training only solves training related issues, and humans have a whole universe to deal with there. And the threats for a staff member working with digital technology, that's a different threat modeling process. There are different contexts, there's different concerns, there's different solutions. And so the way to do this better and more consistently is to do it more and let the participants help guide that process. Have the people who are part of this work to provide those rich veins of exploration for their own threats that they know. Because it's the people who deal with the things who will understand a lot of these threats or have a better idea of it. Outside perspectives are important as well, but let the people do that. And this is where I really like tabletop exercises at a variety of different levels in a variety of different contexts, because it puts that in that thinking, those thought processes in the hands of the people who deal with these threats or might be aware of these threats, so that you can develop those norms, develop that consistency, and get this really valuable information to the rest of the organization so that they can be supported in addressing these threats and getting ahead of them.
Is that not quite a difficult thing to do, Sonia? As a cybersecurity professional, just, listen to input from folk who, wouldn't understand the first thing about what you do.
Well, I guess for Pine in London, because we're open source projects, it's a little bit different. So we're doing threat modeling session as case by case, depending on the feature. But as you mentioned, Jordan, we usually do it with the developers, because at the end of the day, they're the one knowing the code base and all the features that they're building. But also we're doing the threat modeling sessions with different stakeholders. So should it be designers, also product owners. Just in general, it's not only on the developer side, it's just the whole overview of the feature. But we haven't automated that process. Is more just roundtables with the developers or the other stakeholders.
Okay. David Wood from Howden Group wants to know, Ceri, if you don't use user, what term do you use?
People, staff, employee, individuals. I used to work for central government, so I used to be citizen. It's like I've been asked before, as my presentations about the words easy and simple, people ask what's an alternative. You don't need to use an alternative, you just don't need to say the words. You can there are different, it's fine. People, it's fine. People, staff, employees. Most organizations don't call their employees users, they call them employees or staff. They try and create a relationship with that person on an individual basis by not referring to them as just a user. I think security and technology is probably one of the only spaces. I mean, there's lots of memes around that. The only people that call users are drug dealers and technology experts.
Good to remember.
There are a number of memes that have that. So yeah.
I had a boss once who used to refer to getting chimps lined up in a row. We only ever did it once in my career. We've been talking about trying to talk, the people on the floor, the staff members who are actually trying to get this to work, who are trying to be safe. How do you sell this in the first place to the sort of, the upper management, the finance people, that kind of thing? How do you communicate, Jordan, with them under those circumstances? How do you get the message?
You have to tie it to what they care about. And technology is often seen as something that you hand off to someone else to deal with, and it's their problem and it's handled. Early in my career, I was working with a CEO, and I wanted to present to the board, and he looked me dead in the eye and said, "Why?" He says, well, digital technology and digital security is an existential threat to the business, and sort of the whole boilerplate thing as to why. And he looked at me in the eye and said, so is the plumbing. The plumber doesn't get a seat at the board. The head plumber does not talk to the board about this. You deal with the problems, the leaks, the issues. You just deal with it. Why does the board need to get involved? And that really affected my career ever since, because digital technology and plumbing are very, very, very different, because it changes so fast, and it changes based on how people use it. The way that the board wants to use technology personally, the way that they want the company or the organization to use that technology affects how it works. Plumbing is a set thing. There's inputs, there's outputs, it's linear, and there's standards. And yeah, you can push that off to a plumber. When it comes to digital technology, we're making it up as we go along every single day. Almost with every email we send, with new update to the email client, or new technology we put in, the new instant messaging program, all this constant digital transformation. Digital transformation is not a project; it's just happening all the time. We recognize it, whether it's happening or not. So it's about getting that across, that it's not plumbing, that it is all about being flexible, being agile, and dealing with the digital technology. And there are risks in doing so, and those risks can affect the business. So let's work on how we can support the board, senior management, the C-suite. Let's support them so that they know how to handle and leverage the opportunities that digital technology provides the organization. So let's be an enabler. Let's throw a booster rocket on what the board, senior management wants to do, but we need to make sure that we don't, design it in a way that's going to blow up in our faces. And so we need this feedback, we need this back and forth, and we need that education that the board members understand that digital technology is not like plumbing.
Ceri, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is, so one of the things that works really well is storytelling, is to bring it to them in a way that they can see where they fit in that journey and what that story is and how it can develop over time. And telling them in a particular way, just facts and figures, doesn't get the motivation or belief system into people at all. They see those sort of things every day, and it means different things depending on who they are in the organization, from a finance person to the CEO or what have you. But actually the thing that really gets through to people is stories. How, as Dawn said, how does it relate to them? What does it mean for the organization as a whole? And how do we build that wider picture and the more holistic view on actually what's going on through stories?
Have you noticed across your career, Sonia, that that chain that Jordan was talking about? If you've been compared to a plumber at one stage, and people now realising your actual worth.
What I would usually do with not only the boards but the different stakeholders or engineering team is come with some case study, and we'll explain, for example, if you take a topic like, say, the content security policy, and in the case where, for example, let's take it was 3-4 years ago, we had a crypto miner that has been implemented on 4,000 websites, and because they didn't implement some of these techniques, they could have quick wins to protect them against that. Just to tell them the story, to give them examples, but also not only the technical side, because obviously they won't understand the jargon, but the end point would be that the impact on the end user. If they have a crypto miner on the website, obviously it will impact the end user, so the website will be slow and they will bounce away from the website. So having those discussions and having those consequences for, let's say, the website or their application, the dialogue might be different. You don't need to be really technical. It's just to have an overview of this is what happened, but that's actually what's going to be the impact and consequences for the application and the business.
Is it getting harder to spot a CISO in a boardroom? But by that I mean, IT experts in the past, traditionally it was the boys in the background, quite literally. That's obviously changing massively. But if you were to sit a group of people around about a boardroom, you'd be able to say, "Yeah, that's the security expert sitting there."
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, the CISO is evident in the group still. There's a lot of pressure to increase.
Why are they different?
They're the ones who have had zero sleep, look stressed, and are constantly ready to duck for the things that are going to be thrown at them by the rest of the group. There's a growing push to educate some more of the board on this and to make security less of a plumbing issue for organizations. So that will eventually change, and it's changing very slowly. And I was reading an article, was it yesterday, that was it 12% of boards have a cybersecurity expert on the board, and it's looking to grow to like 30%. What was this? Gartner was saying this, head of research at Gartner. Is going to grow to about 30% by 2030, right? And that's sad, but it's still going to mean that the CISO or the cybersecurity expert is going to be a niche skill set on most boards for the foreseeable.
Interesting. Jordan, Sonia and Ceri, that's been fascinating. Thank you very much for 3 really good presentations, and thank you for answering those questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're going to take a break now for about 15 minutes. The next session starts at 11 o'clock. There are several options there. There's time to visit the exhibition hall. There are some great prizes available. I told you about that earlier. Take the time to engage with the sponsors, please. We need to try and encourage them as much as possible, and obviously speak with the other delegates. But for now, from me, Mark Stephen, thank you very much for your attention, and we will see you bright and early back at 11 o'clock. Thank you.